good, YouTube? It's Mannadium back in this video. This game has a lot of hype. There is a lot of people that love overhyping everything. And it can range from, you know, cards to combos to things coming out. But the thing is, there have been a lot of things overhyped that have not quite lived up to expectations, especially recently in the game. Whether that be cards because of the fact that they were just not very good to begin with, or because Konami kind of shifted the ropes and created a ban list, or made it so that certain cards didn't work the way that they were intended, didn't release good support for a particular archetype. Let's cover that in today's video and take a look to see what some of the most overhyped things were. Starting at the top of the list, TISTINA. This was a very overhyped archetype. People always thought that TCG exclusives would be amazing, and they, in their defense, you know, they were pretty good. We had things like the Libromancers, we had decks like Gold Pride Punk that were all decently playable, at least at a tier 2 or higher status. And I'm kind of guilty about this because in certain Squidios, I was telling everyone to pick up these cards, but the fact of the matter is they did go up after Agov cards were spoiled, only to eventually trickle down because people realized, well, this deck doesn't really do anything, and they kind of hyped it up to the point of where we're getting 6 new cards, which culminated in, well, whatever the heck this thing is. This is supposed to be the ace monster? I mean, this deck doesn't even have a 1-card combo. There's no cohesive combo. In fact, there's 0 end board. And you're not sure if this deck wants to go first or second because they just threw a bunch of knickknacks our way, like the trap cards, after somehow creating a bunch of effects that were decently good, going second potentially. So now there's some, you know, a little bit of a tug of war, and, well, the cards just don't do very much, especially in a power crept game state of Yu-Gi-Oh! That we have today. So this was one of the definitely big flops of the year, I would say, in terms of TCG exclusives, and, well, Yu-Gi-Oh! As a whole. I mean, we've been expecting TCG exclusives to be really, really powerful, and when they did print 13 TISTINA cards in total, we expected the deck to be somewhat playable, but nope, this deck is not even playable at tier 3 or tier 4, apparently, so, yeah, this is definitely first on the list. Next is, well, Ground XENO. This, in the similar vein, was released in the side set, and a lot of people were hyping dinosaurs. I mean, Ground XENO is broken. You add a dinosaur tuner monster or a normal monster, then you can pop a baby from your hand. It's a starter slash extender slash everything that the deck basically wants, and then on top of that, it has an effect in the graveyard where it's a polymerization, allowing you to fusion summon into a dinosaur fusion type monster. But the thing is, dinosaurs are just very, very overrated, and they do get a little bit caught in the crossfire, you know, with hand traps flying around now. The fact that Miscellaneousaurus is still at 1 despite the deck not being on the radar for some time. And on top of that, there are popular anti-meta cards that are already countering the rest of the meta, and then dinos just get hurt badly, like cards like Dweller, you know. So I think, you know, the Ground XENO cards were definitely overhyped, given the fact that this card alone was very, very expensive, around $50 to $60 for the longest time before trickling down a little bit to $30 to $40, and it was a chase card of that set. But, you know, the deck just didn't top at all, not even regionals, so it was more or less a flop. And, you know, it's especially sad to think about that because the Xeno cards were so cool, and in tandem with some of the support that we got in the form of Evolzar Lars, I really thought this deck would be decently good. I mean, Lars is a non-once per turn Omni-Negate in the dinosaur deck because as long as he has 2 dinosaur materials, you can just attach 1 material instead of both to target a face-up card your opponent controls and negate that effect. So I thought, hey, this card is insane, especially for 2023, having a double Omni-Negate on 1 body. It's almost like the DDD Heavy King Caesar, but this card just negates anything. But then it turned out to be more or less a flop, which is a little unfortunate, but I'm hoping we eventually get Miscellaneousaurus back to 3 so that dinosaur players can rejoice and start to play a little bit more with their pet deck. Next on the list is a synchro monster that everyone wanted to be banned at the start of the couple of formats ago when this card was actually played. Hot Red Dragon ARCHFIEND King Calamity. Everyone said this card was busted in Mannadium. If Mannadium comboed off, they're going to make this and skip your entire turn. But it turns out that they didn't even need this card, and going into that combo just required endless extra deck space, not to mention making your combo a lot more volatile to certain cards that could actually stop Hot Red Dragon ARCHFIEND from coming out, and just making the standard Dissipator plus Baron de Fleur board plus Appaloosa was a lot better for the deck. But even still, Mannadium was previously a 2-card deck, so no one really considered the deck to be very, very powerful, and it kind of flopped in its own sense. This is pre-Agov talking, of course. But, I mean, we could be talking too soon because, you know, Hot Red Dragon ARCHFIEND is actually playable in the Centurion deck, which is coming out in the upcoming side set Valiant Smashers. So In tandem with Crimson Dragon, you can now make Hot Red Dragon Archfiend off of one card, so I could be wrong here in terms of it actually being a flop for the rest of the year. It could actually be decently good, but at the time of when Mannadium was actually playing this card, it definitely turned out to be a flop because the better players quickly realized that it was very much so a gimmick. And, you know, this card was frightening, but not quite frightening enough for it to be played. And then the last couple of cards that we want to talk about is none other than this archetype, the GISHKI archetype. This deck was absolutely hyped for a longest time because it was decently good in the OCG in tandem with the sprites. Why? Well, it happened so that they actually received some new support in the form of GISHKI Grimness, which is basically a tour guide for a GISHKI monster, and also a ritual monster called Evagishki Nermanas. This is really interesting in this deck specifically because you could constantly loop GISHKI Abyss. GISHKIs being older cards that were released in Dual Terminals 1 and 2 and so on and so forth, did not have the once per turn restriction. So like older cards, they could be constantly looped over and over and over. So as long as you had access to a GISHKI Grimness, you could easily get access to your GISHKI Abyss, have a search, and then go off into something like either a gigantic sprite, or better yet, the card that made this entire combo flop when it came to the TCG finally, the Sprite Elf. This card was quickly banned, and I don't even think GISHKIs were legal at full power for even 1 week or 2 before the ban list finally neutered Elf. But previously, before Elf was banned in the OCG, it was very good because Elf says you can resurrect a level 2 monster from your graveyard during your turn or your opponent's turn, which meant that you could constantly loop the GISHKI Abyss over and over, bring them back from the graveyard, searching for another copy of a GISHKI card, and that by itself allowed you to set up the Evagishki Nermanas, so that's a monster negate, on top of tapping into your sprite combo. And that was just something that was very hyped for a lot of TCG players. They were ready to get their water monsters in tow. And I remember GISHKI Abyss being around $20 to $30 because we never really got a reprint outside of the original dual terminal printing as well as the super rare printing in the Hidden Arsenal. But that quickly came to a stintering conclusion because of the fact that Elf got banned. So yeah, it was just not very good for the deck. And then the last card that we want to talk about, I'm sure you guys all know at the back of your head, so I'm going to give you a couple of seconds here to think about it. But yes, it is none other than this card that was touted as the destroyer of formats itself, Revolution Synchron. This was the only chase card in Duelist Nexus, more or less. That was a really bad set, guys. But it turns out that Revolution Synchron was not quite as revolutionary as his name intended. People were saying, wow, this card is absolutely busted. There's so many ways to play it. You can play it in decks like Tearlaments, using it on a Rhino Heart or potentially a Beast King of the Swamp. That's right, there were actually people in the OCG playing Beast King of the Swamps because of the fact that he's just a level 4 that you can use with the Revolution Synchron. And then from there, you can obviously go into Ancient Fairy Dragon for shenanigans with field spells. And on top of that, just go into the Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon, yada. But unfortunately, in the TCG, we were missing a critical card that was actually made the deck good, and that was none other than the one and only Chaos Ruler, who was already banned in the TCG, which is the only reason probably why Revolution Synchron was actually as revolutionary as he was in the OCG, but in the TCG, he was a big flop, at least for the Tearlaments. Now, that didn't stop there. People were still trying to jam this card into basically everything that had a level 4 body because they thought Ancient Fairy Dragon was just so busted, being able to go into Crystal Wing as well, being Omni Negate, ooh, stopping Nib. Everyone thought it was busted in decks like Raisin, Vanquish Soul, but the problem is you still had to draw Raisin, which the deck was still struggling against, so it didn't really solve that problem there. People quickly realized it was bad. There were still people trying to play it in dedicated Synchron decks. They were like, wow, guys, this is going to make Synchron suddenly good again. We can make a full Omni Negate board with like 5 freaking negates and like 5 cards in hand, or like whatever the heck Hyper Librarian draws. Reborn Tank was hitting $15, $20, guys. But it turned out that, you know, these decks are just mad gimmicky, and Revolution Synchron was just bad. You had to stick a level 4 body on the board that it doesn't get disrupted, and then you have to, well, synchro off with them, and then you get a glow bulb in your graveyard, but you have to control a synchro monster, and all of this was just very hard to accomplish when your opponent could disrupt your combo at any point in time. And Revolution Synchron was not a true extender because you did require a body on the board, which if your opponent is half confident, they probably see coming, so they'll say no, goodbye, Book of Moon on your level 4. Not to mention the level 7 synchros were just not that great. Basically, we had an Ancient Fairy Dragon, but you also had to play Crystal Wing. It was already like 3 or 4 cards in your extra deck. You couldn't afford to play cards like Black Rose Dragon, which were just gimmicks at that point. And, you know, the cost for the reward of actually resolving his Synchro using Revolution Synchron was just not very good. Like, a Crystal Wing Synchro Dragon is just not a good card anymore, and you're investing basically 2 cards to make it. So, you know, nowadays we really rely on 1-card combos in Yu-Gi-Oh! And stuff that are really, really gimmicky, like Revolution Synchron, that actually requires a set condition to serve as an extender to be able to play the card, means that it's probably not very good. And, you know, I was one of the ones that drank the Kool-Aid. I thought this card was going to be good, but no, it was bad. So, yeah, that's about all I had for this video. If you guys have any cards that you thought were mega flops, let us know in the comments below, because I'd love to see what we missed here. I know there are a lot of flops in the format recently, and it's kind of fun to see how TCG players anticipate and overhype the crap out of everything, only to see it flop, mega flop hard. Other than that, we'll see you guys in the next video. Thanks for tuning in. Bye-bye.